The city of Camden, a quiet suburban neighborhood on the edge of Washington, D.C., was bathed in the golden glow of a late summer afternoon. The air was thick with humidity, the sounds of cicadas echoing through the neighborhood, and the faint hum of traffic trickling in the distance. The streets, lined with rows of brick houses, felt almost timeless. The neighborhood had a sense of history and undercurrent of stories that lingered like the heat from the asphalt, familiar but rarely spoken of. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are listening. Your support means everything. Inside a modest brick house near the corner of 7th and E, Rosa Thompson, a woman of 72, sat by her living room window, sipping a cup of chamomile tea. Her fingers, weathered from years of life's challenges, clutched the warm mug as her eyes scanned the street. Rosa had seen it all: the struggles, the small joys, the changes that had shaped this neighborhood over decades. But what weighed most heavily on her heart was the deep-seated fear that, despite the progress, the world still hadn't quite changed for people like her. Her son, Elijah Thompson, was one of the few who had managed to escape the cycle that so many others found themselves trapped in. A successful attorney who had worked his way up from humble beginnings, Elijah was now the U.S. Attorney General. Yet, Rosa couldn't shake the feeling that, despite his accomplishments, her son, like so many of their people, was still fighting an invisible battle, one that might cost him everything. It was around 4:30 in the afternoon when Rosa's quiet routine was disturbed by the harsh screech of tires. The sound came from across the street, where a squad car had just parked near a row of townhomes. Rosa's heart skipped a beat. She had seen that car before. Camden wasn't the safest place for black families, and though things had improved over the years, there was an underlying tension in the air. Police presence, though often justified, felt different when it came to people like her. She had always lived in this house, always kept to herself. But as a black woman, especially one of her age, she had often been the subject of casual disrespect, from the way people looked at her when she walked into stores to the whispers she caught when she passed by certain groups. But this time, it felt different. Rosa couldn't explain it. The moment the officers stepped out of the car, she felt a cold dread wash over her. Two officers approached a neighbor's car parked in front of her house. They were young, in their 20s, and as they spoke to the driver, Rosa saw the casual dismissiveness in their movements. She had lived long enough to know the signs: a nervous glance, an unnecessary show of power, an officer blocking the driver's path for no reason. She had been a witness to it all before, but this was her street, her home, and she couldn't just sit by and watch. Rosa had seen the tension between law enforcement and her community simmer for years. It wasn't the overt racism of decades past, but something insidious and more dangerous. The small microaggressions, the subtle discrimination that had become so ingrained, so systemic, that it was now invisible to many. She had witnessed it firsthand. Young black men stopped on the street for no reason. A quick glance at a black woman's purse. A condescending name that somehow always felt patronizing. As the officer questioned the driver, Rosa stood up and walked to her porch. She was no stranger to confrontation, though she avoided it when she could. But something told her that this wasn't just a typical traffic stop. She couldn't help herself. She stood on the porch and watched, her back straight, her hands steady, and her eyes locked on the officers. It wasn't long before the situation escalated. The driver, the young black man she recognized from around the block, was suddenly being pulled out of his car. Rosa's heart raced. She could hear his voice rising, filled with frustration and fear. He was demanding to know why he was being detained. The officers weren't responding, their words sharp and harsh, but it was clear they were acting on impulse. Then one officer, seeing Rosa watching from her porch, turned toward her. His face was filled with a mix of arrogance and something darker, suspicion. "Ma'am," the officer called out, "can I help you?" Rosa's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground. "I don't see why you need to arrest him," she said, her voice calm but firm. "What did he do?" The officer stepped toward her, his hand on his holster, and his tone shifted to one that was meant to intimidate. "You don't need to get involved, lady. Go inside." The words hit her like a slap, but Rose's resolve only grew. She wasn't going to back down. She had lived long enough to know what silence could cost. This wasn't just about the young man on the curb. This was about something bigger, something more dangerous. "You don't get to tell me what to do on my own property," Rosa said, her voice now rising with the kind of power only years of lived experience could bring. "You have no right to arrest him. He's done nothing wrong." The officer paused, his gaze lingering on her face. Something in his eyes shifted, a flicker of disdain. It was as if he saw her not as a person but as a challenge to his authority, a problem to be dealt with. In a swift motion, the officer grabbed Rose's arm, yanking her forward with surprising strength for someone his size. "You're under arrest for interfering with an investigation," he said coldly. The words hit her like a blow to the stomach. Her mouth went dry. For a moment, she could only stand there, disoriented, as her mind struggled to process what was happening. She had been arrested, just like that, and in front of her own house. But Rosa had lived through worse. She had fought battles before, ones that had stolen so much from her, and she wasn't about to let this be one of them. With trembling fingers, she pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed the number she knew by heart. It rang twice before the voice on the other end picked up. "Mom." Elijah's voice was immediately concerned, though tinged with impatience. "What's going on, baby? I need you." Rose's voice cracked, but she steadied herself. "They've arrested me. The cops." She stopped herself, her voice trembling as she tried to keep her composure. "They've arrested me for nothing. You need to come get me, Elijah. Please." The days that followed felt like a blur, but in that blur was clarity. Rose's arrest became the story of the week. News spread quickly, and it wasn't long before Rosa Thompson, the U.S. Attorney General, became involved. He had seen enough. His mother, arrested on her own property for speaking out against blatant injustice. The optics were unbearable, and while Elijah had always kept his personal and professional lives separate, this was not something he could ignore. He arrived at the police station within the hour, his presence an undeniable weight in the room. The officers who had been involved in his mother's arrest visibly shifted in their seats when they saw him walk through the door. He spoke with the chief of police, with the mayor, with anyone who would listen. The incident was a national story now, and Elijah wasn't going to let it fade into the background like so many others had. The fallout was immediate and overwhelming. Calls for accountability echoed through the streets, from activists, politicians, and everyday citizens who had witnessed the injustice unfold. Public pressure mounted. Rose's arrest, though a small incident in a vast sea of similar cases, had sparked something bigger. It was a turning point. Months later, the officer responsible for the arrest was removed from the force. His actions were found to be in direct violation of departmental policies. The case was settled in court, and the city paid a hefty settlement to Rosa Thompson for her wrongful arrest. But for Rosa, the resolution was bittersweet. The power to change the system didn't lie in legal victories or public outcry. It lay in the quiet moments, the ones where she could look her son in the eye and know that, together, they had made a difference. As she sat back in her chair, watching the sun set over her neighborhood, Rosa realized that the real victory was not in the headlines, but in the quiet, steadfast resistance to a world that had long tried to silence her. The weeks that followed the apology letter were filled with meetings, phone calls, and strategy sessions. Rosa, with the unwavering support of Elijah and Gloria, began to speak at local town halls. She shared her story with anyone who would listen, but not in the way they expected. She didn't stand before them as a victim. She stood as a woman with a purpose. She spoke of the systemic issues that had led to her arrest. She talked about the lives affected by microaggressions, discrimination, and the subtle but deadly ways racism permeated every corner of society. Her message wasn't just about her experience. It was about the collective experience of everyone who had ever been marginalized, ignored, or judged for the color of their skin. Elijah, though a figure of national prominence, also stood beside her at these meetings, but he allowed his mother to lead. It was a powerful image, as the Attorney General, known for his powerful speeches and formidable presence, humbly stepping aside for his mother, the woman who had spent a lifetime teaching him the value of resilience and dignity. In the midst of all this, a realization began to form within Rosa. The police department's apology, the legal victories, and the public awareness were important, yes, but they were only small pieces in a much larger puzzle. Real change wouldn't come from apologies or settlements. It would come from the gradual, consistent effort to dismantle the systems that allowed this kind of injustice to thrive. And so, Rosa made a decision. She would start an initiative, a grassroots movement aimed at combating systemic racism within law enforcement. It wouldn't just be about raising awareness. It would be about advocating for tangible, sustainable change. She began to work with local organizations, scholars, and activists, building a coalition to push for reforms in training, community engagement, and oversight. The goal wasn't just to challenge the officers who had wronged her, it was to challenge an entire culture. Elijah, too, supported his mother's mission. His position allowed him to bring greater attention to these issues on a national level. And while there were still skeptics, there were many more who rallied behind Rosa's cause. The road to reform was long and difficult. There were setbacks, resistance from powerful voices, and moments of despair. But Rosa, at the age of 73, had never been more determined. She had learned long ago that the fight for justice was never quick or easy. It required patience, persistence, and an unwavering belief in the possibility of change. And she was willing to fight for that change, for as long as it took. In the years that followed, Rosa's initiative gained momentum. It became a powerful force in Camden and beyond. Law enforcement agencies were forced to reevaluate their training practices, and new policies were implemented to foster greater accountability and transparency. While the battle was far from over, Rosa felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that her efforts had begun to make a difference. She had lived through hardship, discrimination, and injustice. But in the end, Rosa Thompson had become more than a woman whose story was lost in the headlines. She had become a symbol of resilience, a beacon for those still struggling to be heard. As the seasons changed once again, Rosa sat on her porch, the cool breeze brushing against her face. The sound of children playing in the street echoed in the distance, a sound that always brought her comfort. Her son, Elijah, had been busy with his work, but he always made time to check in on her. She smiled softly, knowing that the fight they had started together was far from over. But for now, in this moment, the world felt a little bit lighter. And in her heart, Rosa knew that she had done more than just survive. She had fought, and in that fight, she had changed the world one step at a time, Chad said. As the months passed, Rosa's efforts to bring about change continued to build momentum. What started as a local movement in Camden blossomed into a larger regional campaign, with activists, scholars, and concerned citizens rallying around her cause. Her initiative, born from the painful experience of her arrest, had become a lifeline for many who had felt silenced for too long. Elijah, despite his responsibilities as U.S. Attorney General, made sure he was involved every step of the way. He understood that his mother's fight wasn't just hers, it was a reflection of the struggles so many others were enduring. They had been born into a world where the odds were stacked against them, but Rosa's resilience had taught him that change was possible, no matter the obstacles. His role wasn't just to support her as her son. It was to use his power and influence to push forward the reforms she had ignited. The campaign, now branded as the Rosa Initiative, began to gather attention from national and international media. Rosa appeared on panels, spoke at protests, and wrote op-eds in newspapers. Her voice, once an ordinary whisper in the wind, now carried weight. She was becoming a symbol of resistance, a testament to what could happen when one woman stood up against injustice and refused to back down. But with this newfound recognition came a barrage of challenges. Rosa wasn't naive. She knew how systems of power operated. She'd spent decades watching as people like her were silenced, ignored, or forgotten. Despite the progress the country had made in the past century, the core issues still festered under the surface. And as her movement gained visibility, she became a target not just of those who were complicit in the system, but of those who feared what might happen if change really came. One evening, as Rosa prepared for another public event, a large rally at the state capitol, she found herself at the kitchen table, writing yet another speech. Her mind, however, kept wandering. The victory at the police station, the removal of the officer who had arrested her, felt like a distant memory now. What had once been a personal battle was now a nationwide cause, and the responsibility weighed heavily on her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every Black woman who had ever been treated unfairly by the system, for every person of color who had suffered in silence. She paused, her pen hovering over the paper, and glanced at the photo of Elijah on the wall, taken years ago when he had graduated from law school. He had come so far, but she couldn't help but feel that the fight was far from over for him, too. His success in the political arena had come at a cost, the constant balancing act between public expectations and personal convictions. Between doing what was right and doing what was politically expedient. Just then, there was a knock at the door. It was Gloria, her trusted friend and ally. "Rosa, they're waiting for you outside," Gloria said, her voice low but urgent. "We need to go. The rally's starting soon." Rosa nodded and stood up. As she walked toward the door, her thoughts were interrupted by the phone buzzing on the counter. It was a message from Elijah. "Mom, I know you've got this rally today. Just remember, it's not just about them hearing you, it's about making sure they never forget what we stand for. Love you." Rosa smiled softly at the message. Elijah had always been her rock, even when he was miles away. But this wasn't just about speeches and platforms, it was about the quiet strength that had always been her true power. The rally was held at the state capitol, where thousands had gathered. The streets were filled with people of all races, ages, and backgrounds, united in their desire to see change. The atmosphere was electric. There was a sense of purpose in the air, and as Rosa stepped up to the stage, the crowd erupted in applause. She could feel the weight of their eyes, but she also felt the warmth of their support. This was the moment. Rosa took the microphone in her hand, and for a brief second, the noise around her faded. The familiar weight of the injustice she had lived through for decades seemed to lift from her shoulders. She wasn't alone anymore. "I stand here today," she began, her voice steady and strong, not just as Rosa Thompson, but as every Black woman who has ever been silenced, every mother who has ever had to fight for her children's future, and every person who has been made to feel like they are not enough. "I stand here because I know that our voices matter. And together, we will not be silenced again." The crowd cheered, but Rosa kept speaking, each word imbued with the passion she had carried for so long. She spoke of systemic racism, of the need for change in law enforcement, and the importance of dismantling the structures that kept people in power comfortable while those without power suffered. She spoke of the importance of unity, of solidarity, and of never giving up, no matter the obstacles. "We will rise together, we will be heard, and we will make sure that those in power understand that we will no longer accept injustice," she declared. The rally continued long into the night, and as it wound down, Rosa felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had no illusions that the fight was over. This was just the beginning. But as she stood on that stage, Watching the faces of the people in the crowd, she knew that they had made something powerful, something real. In the days that followed, Rosa's initiative continued to gain ground. New alliances were formed with other civil rights organizations, and Elijah used his political influence to ensure that reform efforts were not merely symbolic, but concrete and effective. Change was slow, but it was happening. One afternoon, as Rosa sat by her window, watching the sun set over Camden, she reflected on how far they had come. She thought of Elijah, who had always been her beacon of hope, and of how, together, they had carved out a path that was leading to something bigger than they had ever imagined. Rosa knew the road ahead would be long, filled with more challenges and setbacks. But now, she no longer walked it alone. She had the support of a nation, the strength of her community, and the power of truth on her side. As the sky darkened, Rosa stood up, looking out the window one last time. The world was changing, and she had helped make it happen. Her fight was far from over, but as long as she had breath in her lungs, she would continue to fight, not just for her family, but for every single person who had ever been denied justice. And with that resolve, Rosa Thompson walked forward into the night, knowing that, together, they would make the world a better place.